Good afternoon and welcome to the channel. My name is Dave and this is the fourth attempt I've had at making this video. I keep cocking it up. Anyway, let's get on with auxiliary battery systems. Now, what are they? They're a system that supplies power to your vehicle and other devices that is independent from the vehicle starter batteries. So why do we need them? Well, we need them to power such devices as fridges, lights, etc., battery charging, things like that, when the car is not running, and so that the vehicle starter batteries do not get discharged, because we need the discharge, we need the starter battery to start the engine. If without a start the engine, we can get stranded. So, about battery charging and powering the devices, there are four main battery types: flooded, lead acid. Now, these are the batteries that you normally find in your engine bay. They are designed for a quick burst of power and then a quick recharge, ready to go again when you need to restart your engine. They consist of lead plates in an acid solution, usually sulfuric acid, and they can be sealed, but they quite often aren't, and they require topping up with distilled water. The fact is, they may leak, which makes them unsuitable for the use in the cab of your vehicle. They also give off toxic gases in the form of hydrogen, which is really more flammable and toxic. But anyway, you don't want hydrogen gas in your cab, because one spark and you'll blow up. Okay, so the next type of battery is an AGM battery. Now, this stands for Absorbent Glass Mat, and they're generally used for auxiliary or deep cycle situations. However, lithium has taken over a little bit, but AGM are often still there. Deep cycle means they're designed to be discharged over a long period of time and discharged a long way, and then part of the cycle is to charge them back up again from their deep discharge. They're sealed, or they can be sealed. They can also not be sealed, and they're generally spill proof, which is the AGM, the absorbent glass mat part of it. They don't give off as much hydrogen gas. They're able to absorb most of the hydrogen gas as the flooded lead battery does, lead acid battery. Therefore, this makes them more suitable for cab use. A tiny bit of hydrogen gas isn't going to cause any issues. Typically, an AGM battery can only be discharged around about 50%. You can discharge them further. Doesn't do their life any good, but you can discharge them to about 50%. So if it's rated to say 120 ampere hour, you're only going to get 50%. That's only 60 ampere hour. So bear that in mind when you buy an AGM battery. You're only going to get around about a half capacity. Now, there's another battery called a sodium-ion. These are recent batteries. They've only just been released by a Chinese company called CATL. They say that the chemicals contained within them are not as nasty as the lithium-ion batteries. They don't use copper, cobalt or lithium. These are the Achilles heel of the lithium, I have to say. We'll have to wait for these batteries to become more readily available. I believe people are starting to use them, and they're in pre-production models. We'll have to wait and see whether they're a better choice for the four-wheel drive user. I think weight and capacity would be the big killers for these if they're not as good. Now, when it comes to capacity and weight, lithium-ion describes the way in which these batteries work. In most four-wheel drive scenarios, we use LiFePO4 batteries, or lithium ferrous phosphate, or in some cases lithium iron phosphate. These tend to be a lot safer for four-wheel drive applications, because they're not as volatile as a lot of the other batteries. We've all seen the videos of the Teslas just bursting into flames and things like that. So these batteries tend to be a bit more a bit safer. However, they're not as good as some of the other chemicals that are used in these batteries, but they're a good all-round battery, and a lot safer. Now, I replaced my 120 ampere hour AGM battery with a 100 ampere hour lithium battery. Now, there's two general reasons that most people do this: weight and output. It certainly isn't cost, because cost of lithium is huge. Weight and output. I had a 20 ampere hour AGM battery which weighed in at around about 32 kilograms. They aren't light with all that lead in them. Its output was around about 60 ampere hours, and I replaced it with a 100 ampere hour lithium battery which weighed in at 9 kilograms, and it can output 80 to 90% of its capacity, around about 90 ampere hours. After a typical camping trip, it would take around 6 to 8 hours of driving to recharge the AGM battery back to 100%, whereas the lithium usually takes 1 to 2 hours. It's a lot quicker to recharge for me, anyway. I saved 24 kilograms of weight. I reduced the physical size of the battery and gained 40 ampere hours by switching to lithium. However, lithium batteries aren't cheap. Now, I didn't plan on talking about this, but I saw a YouTube video the other night that talked about the different classes of lithium cells. Now, most lithium batteries are made up of cells like these. These are 18650 lithium cells, and what they do is they put them all together and they spot weld a strip along the top and on the bottom to make them all connect together, and they put enough in there to create enough voltage for the battery. Now that needs a battery management system, so that's incorporated into the battery as well, but there is no fluid in there except for what's the little bit of electrolyte which is in each cell. Now, they have different classes: class A, class B and class C. Now, when they manufacture lithium cells, they test them, and if they meet the testing requirements, they're called class A. If they're slightly out, they're called class B, and most consumers can't tell the difference between class A and class B. Class C are usually a long way out and are trash, and you don't want to buy class C batteries. So there is a scam out there where a lot of companies will sell cheap batteries, so $300 or $400 for a 100 ampere hour battery, and they say they're class A batteries, but the fact is this chap was he'd been working in the battery area for a long time, and he said you can't physically make a class A battery for $400. It's not possible. He said by the time you've bought the batteries and you've bought all the bits and pieces, you've put them all in, you've done all the testing, and you've shipped them over to wherever you live, they're over $400. So there is a bit of a scam, so buyer beware that although class B batteries are okay, you could be getting not what they're saying they are, class A batteries. So that's just an added bit of information for you there. Don't know why I'm putting my glasses on. Okay, I've talked about the BMS. What the BMS does is it will prevent each cell from being discharged below 2.5 volts and charging above 3.65 volts, or 10 to 14.6 volts for the entire battery. They also provide short circuit and overload protection, as well as high and low temperature protection. Now, there are different BMSs. Some BMSs have a lot of features, other BMSs are basic. So when we go camping, especially in remote areas, we need to provide power to things like fridges, lights, and if we connected these to the starter battery, they would slowly discharge and we would not be able to start our engine. And without the engine there's no alternator, therefore we cannot charge the batteries back up and we're stranded. And if you're out in the desert, you don't want to be stranded because you ain't going to help. So that's another thing. You can have one of those emergency beacons, but just be aware, if you set that off, they're going to come and rescue you. You ain't rescuing your car. So if you're stranded in the middle of the desert, you're stranded in the middle of the desert. You've got to go back and get your car yourself. Okay, we could keep starting the car and running the engine to charge the battery back up. It's not an ideal situation though, because it's risky. If you forget once, your battery's done and you're stranded. So the answer is an auxiliary battery in the back of the car, separate from the engine, to power the devices in the back like the fridge. This allows the devices to have power but won't discharge the starter battery. And that's great, but hang on a second, what happens when your auxiliary battery is discharged? Well, if you're only going for a weekend, then that's fine, if your battery is big enough. But a longer period and you're going to have spoiled food when your battery discharges and all your equipment turns off. So there is not typically any way of recharging that battery whilst away from home. That's a problem. So why not connect the auxiliary battery to the starter battery? That's a good idea. You could just connect them together and they will charge. They'll both charge from the alternator if the engine's running. But if you just connect them together and you turn off your engine, they'll both discharge at the same rate. So you might have twice as much power, but they'll discharge at the same rate, and then again you'll have no starter battery. So one solution is to place a battery isolator between the two batteries. It can be just a switch. That's fantastic. You get there to your location, you turn the switch, your starter battery's isolated, it won't discharge, and your battery discharges in the back. Problem solved. Until the day you get there and you forget to turn the switch off and your battery discharges and you're stranded. So you don't want that. So you can use a smart battery isolator, sometimes called voltage sensitive relay, VSR. So it'll stop the starter battery getting discharged. Fantastic, a great solution. But it's not quite that simple. Modern cars have what are called smart alternators. Now, I hate that term smart because it infers that they're clever and they'll do what you want them to do, and they just are not clever at all. They're not smart, they're dumb. So they should be called dumb alternators. Smart because they turn off and conserve power, but dumb because they don't want to do what you want them to do. So once your alternator detects your starter battery is fully charged, it will turn off the charging until it needs it again. And that's usually after you've stopped to start the car. So you've charged all your batteries up, you've set off on your journey, you're going to travel about 10 hours or whatever, and your alternator charges up the battery and stops. Your auxiliary battery in the back is powering your fridge and bits and pieces in the back, but it's not getting charged because the starter battery is full. You get to your location, you turn off your engine, you look in the back, and your auxiliary battery in the back is only half charged. Okay, so that's a problem too, because you can't then recharge it. So what do? Well, you do what most of us do, and you fit a DC to DC charger. Now, DC to DC chargers have a battery charging profile, so you can run a different chemistry of battery. So you can have a lead acid and a lithium, because the DC to DC charger can manage the charging profile of the battery in the back. Most modern DC to DC chargers come with what's called a alternator sense cable or a sense wire, and you connect that to your starter circuit, and that will keep your DC to DC charger on and charging even when the alternator turns off. Now, if the alternator's off, how is it going to keep it charging? Well, what it does is it draws power from your starter battery while you're driving, and once that gets to 12.8 volts, then your alternator switches back on and recharges it again. So therefore you get your battery charging in the back. Okay, that solves that problem if you've got a modern car. The Jackaroo Trooper doesn't have a smart alternator, or mine certainly doesn't. So I don't have that problem. So I run a Renogy DCC50S. Now I'm going to show you one of those now, and then I'm going to talk about it, and I'll talk about it a bit more when I show you the car. So what have I got in my car? So let's talk about this before we have a look. Firstly, I have two starter batteries. The power sent to the DC charger from the alternator firstly goes to the driver side starter battery, and then because the two batteries are linked, it charges both of them. Enabling it to charge both of the batteries is fantastic, because you've got two batteries. From the driver's side battery, a twin core 6 gauge power cable is sent to the DC charger to provide power to it. Now we use a 6 gauge cable, which comes as a recommended cable because we want to reduce voltage drop, and the bigger the cable, the less voltage drop you'll get. Now, so the earth lead goes from the battery into the back directly. I'll show you that in a minute. The positive lead goes to a fuse. It goes from the fuse to an isolator, and then from the isolator it goes into the back of the car. Now there are two reasons why I've done this. A, you need the fuse as close to the battery as possible, and I'll explain that in a second. And the isolator is a manual switch, and that is there to isolate the back from the front, or the front from the back, when you're working on the systems and you don't want power coming through and giving you a nasty zap. Okay, so why is the fuse placed close to the battery? You need the fuse as close to the battery as you can get it. And the reason is, if you have a cable that disconnects and shorts out, you need the fuse to blow as quickly as possible. If you had the fuse near the DC to DC charger in the back, you'd have all that cable running through the car that still had power in it. So if it was shorted out, it could be overheating, and all that length of cable is getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and eventually it'll melt, catch fire. Because it's under the carpet, it'll set fire to your carpet and your car will be burnt out. So you put the fuse close to the battery so you don't have any power running beyond that fuse if it's a problem. That's the reason why you do that. If you really want to, you could have a fuse at either end. It's a bit not that necessary, but you could do that if you wanted. Alright, so the cables, the six gauge cables now go into the back. Now there are 6mm, there are 6 gauge, there are 6mm core, there are 6mm diameter. There's all sorts of different, it's very confusing, and a 6 gauge. Make sure that you get quality 6 gauge cable, and it's really 6 gauge cable with copper core, because you don't want aluminium core because they're cheap. They put them in there, aluminium strands, because they're cheap, and they don't conduct electricity as well. So buy a good quality copper core cable. Now sometimes you can get thick insulation and you've got less copper core then, so you want a large area of copper inside with a thinner insulation around it. That's the way to go. Now then, so the cable goes in through the bulkhead, goes down under the carpet, out into the back, and into my DC-DC charger. Comes out of the DC-DC charger and goes to a 60 amp trip switch, and then from the 60 amp trip switch it goes into the battery and charges the battery. So the 60 amp trip switch is there at that end to protect the cables from the battery at that side, yeah, as well as the fuse that's in the front to protect the battery at that end. So you've got protection on both batteries, so you can't get power down the cables. The earth goes to, it used to go to a bus bar. I had a bus bar in there, but since then I've installed what's called a shunt, and that allows me to monitor on a screen the output and input of the battery and the DC-DC charger. That shunt has replaced the bus bar, so all the earth cables go to that, so they're all connected together. Now, from the battery, auxiliary battery, I have from 4 gauge cables. Now these are pretty thick diameter cables. They go to my 2000 watt continuous 4000 watt surge inverter. I also have a Bluetooth connector which allows me to monitor via my mobile phone the battery input and output too. Alright, so I use that when I'm camping and I use the other one when I'm traveling. So, inverters. Do you need an inverter? Well, what an inverter does, and I'm sure I don't really need to tell you this, it converts 12 volt DC into 240 volt AC and will allow you to bring along appliances from home to use in your car. Now, it's limited by your inverter output. So if I've got a 2000 watt inverter, I can't take anything that's runs at more than 2000 watts. Okay, so you've got to bear in mind as well that 2000 watts is a lot of power, and it's going to empty your auxiliary battery pretty quickly. So bear that in mind. Start your engine, plug in your solar, keep your battery topped up as best you can while you're using your inverter. We'll talk about inverters a little bit more in a minute, but the Renogy DCC 50S DC to DC charger, so what features does that have? It has what it says on the tin. It does 50 amps. It will provide 50 amps of charge into the auxiliary battery. Now, my auxiliary battery has a maximum of a 50 amp input, so that works for me. That's why I particularly bought that one, but that works for me. And it has a built-in MPPT solar controller. Now, I'll talk about solar controllers in a minute, but you can use both the alternator input and the solar input at the same time. So I can have a solar panel on the roof providing input, and I can have my alternator providing input, and if it gets up to 50 volts, that's 50 amps, that's great. The battery, the DC to DC charger can also charge several battery types: AGM, flooded lead acid, calcium, lithium, whatever. You just set it, and then that's the charging profile it will use. It has a battery temperature probe, and you can attach that. I attach that to my auxiliary battery, and it will monitor the battery and tell me what the temperature is, because we don't want it to get too hot. The battery has a built-in over voltage. The DC to DC charger, has a built-in over voltage protection. It has built-in over current protection. Has built-in voltage sensing relays. It has built-in reverse current protection, and it has a solar panel and alternator reverse polarity protection. These are all electrical things not to worry about when you've got a thing that protects you from them. So, what to buy for your first setup? Well, if I was buying my first setup and I know what I know now, or if I was doing a replacement setup, I wouldn't cheap out, because it really is false economy. When I first started, I bought a cheap DC to DC charger from eBay, and while it was the better end of cheap, it let me down, and I ended up spending $180 on that for no reason at all. I bought a 120 ampere hour AGM battery, and although it was a good brand and it was at a great price, it was far too heavy, and I didn't have enough output. 60 amps wasn't enough, it would go flat quite often. I also bought an eBay inverter, which is the one I've still got in my car, from a well-known Chinese manufacturer. However, I'm still unsure whether it was the right purchase, and I'm always wondering whether it works as it should. Who knows? However, the deep cycle battery, that's important, because that's what's providing you power. Buy as good a lithium battery as you can afford, is what I would say. Now, when I say that, I don't mean go and spend $2,000, but whatever you do, just have a look around, buy something reasonable. The weight saving and the cost of that, and then the output alone are worth the cost. They're getting cheaper all the time, and I would definitely purchase a lithium ferrous oxide battery again. And they're a safer bet than other lithium chemical options, and this is the reason why. Lithium batteries are always made from a number of smaller cells. I've shown you the 18650s. All wafer batteries. Some have got wafers and I'll have maybe 4 or 5 of those. And they've always been spot welded together. Now, I've heard stories of spot welding coming apart on some batteries when used in a vehicle off-road. Kings state that their lithium batteries have been shake tested. So I would look for a battery that has been through this type of testing. Make sure it's suitable for use in a car. I would also use a battery that fits in a battery box. There is no need to go expensive with battery boxes either. I use an Aldi battery box, as I'll show you in the video. I have a King's one as well. They're both good price, and they both work fine. The box protects the battery, and it provides several outputs to help with charging phones and plugging in fridges, etc. What I would suggest you do is you work out your power requirements for any equipment you use all the time, such as your fridge and your lights, and add some power for things like charging batteries, charging phones, charging I even have a 12-volt electric blanket, and charging whatever. Just add some for that, and then you'll come up with a battery output. And then so choose a battery that will provide you enough power for about 48 hours or maybe up to 72 hours without having to be charged, just in case. Okay, so charging cables and switches we've touched on. I would make sure you buy a crimper and crimp proper metal crimps onto the end of your cables. Make sure you use good quality cable. Make sure you use good quality fuses. Go somewhere like Jackaroo, buy decent equipment, and if you're in any doubt as to the size of the cable, buy the next size up. Spend the money, buy decent stuff. Now, we're going to talk quickly about a solar input. So why have a solar input? Well, it keeps your auxiliary battery charged when you're camping and not driving around, because it's putting charge into your battery. It is entirely your decision to purchase solar and decide whether you want rigid panels, flexible panels, a blanket, or portable panels. I would recommend doing some research here though. I have a King's 200 watt solar blanket that provides up to approximately 11 amps of charge. The other reason for buying a Renogy DC to DC charger for me as well was because once the auxiliary battery is full from solar charging, it will send the excess charge to the starter battery. So if your starter batteries have got something that's drawing them down and you're there for 2 weeks or something, then the charger will keep them topped up. So do you want a blanket or a semi-rigid flexible panel? Semi-flexible panel. Rigid panels are normally glass covered with an alloy frame. They can be a bit heavy, can be mounted on roof racks, tops of tents, roof tents that is, and to maximise solar channel when you're charging, when you're using your vehicle, when you're driving or parked. They'll work all the time. I've parked my car and put my solar blanket on the top and left it there for the afternoon to keep my battery charged up. Semi-flexible panels can be stuck onto the top of a caravan or a rooftop tent. They are lighter and becoming more popular. They can be shaped around gentle curves such as caravan roofs, etc. So that would be a good aerodynamic choice. Now, solar blankets or folding panels can be used when they are needed and have the advantage of being able to be moved around to maximise the sun's position. They fold up smaller and can easily be carried by a vehicle and put away when not required. Now, the problem with mounting a solar panel on your rooftop tent is you have to park your rooftop tent out into the sun. Otherwise the solar panel won't get enough charge. Now the sun, obviously the earth spins and the sun moves around in the sky, so you're either going to have to move your vehicle around or you're going to have to put up with a lesser charge once the sun moves, goes behind your car. So if you're camping and you're staying in one place all the time, maybe the folding solar panels are the way to go for you. If you travel around a lot, maybe the solar blanket's the way to go, because it folds up smaller and has less of a footprint. Tends to be a bit lighter as well. Portable solar panels tend to have legs allowing you to angle them towards the sun, but then some solar blankets do too. So just do a bit of shopping around and do a bit of research. Now, PWM and MPPT controllers. PWM stands for pulse width modulation. It charges by pulsing power into your battery and can vary the pulse time, the length or the width, which is the modulation part. Now, that sounds technical, but what happens is the controller allows the battery to charge, then it turns off the charge and measures the voltage of the battery, and then it turns the charge back on again and then charges some more, and then switches off again and measures the voltage again, and so on. Now, it can vary the amount of charging and it can vary the amount of time it's switched off, but it can't increase the voltage. And this is the Achilles heel of PWM. When you connect a PWM controller, the battery will pull the 18 plus volts of the panel down to just above the battery voltage, and the controller cannot change this voltage. It will increase slowly as the battery charge increases to keep it just above the charge, but once charged, the controller will shorten the charge time and increase the measuring time to keep it topped up. So why purchase a PWM controller? Well, the cost. They are less complex, so cheaper to make. They are less complex and can be more reliable as well, so because there's less to go wrong. And the cons for a PWM, well, because they charge slightly above battery voltage, they're not that efficient. They're only about 70% efficient. And you can't use a 24 volt panel. You can only use a 12 volt panel, which outputs around 18 volts. And they're not ideal for larger setups. Okay, so MPPT, or maximum power point tracking, their controllers allows the input voltage to be outputted at a different level. The output from your solar panel is going to the controller, and the controller will take the voltage required and multiply it by the number of amps. You get the input power the same as PWM, but you get it a higher amps. So what it does, it'll look at the voltage required by the battery, so let's say 13. It'll look at what input you've got, so let's say 200 watts, and it'll multiply the number of amps to get up to the wattage with a small amount of inefficiency built in. So let's say 13 volts, 15 amps equals 195 watts. You're getting the same 13 volts but at 15 amps. Also, the MPPT is able to track the incoming power and make the best of that power. For example, if a cloud goes over the panel and you get less input, the controller can still produce some power where the PWM will turn off until the voltage returns. So the pros for MPPT are it's much more efficient. It can maximize the entire panel output, it can produce power during low light conditions, and it can use both 12 and 24 volt. The cons for MPPT are it can be bigger than a PWM controller, and they're more complex, so they cost a little bit more. I have a video that advises how not to get ripped off buying solar blankets and controllers. I suggest if you haven't seen it, then go and watch it. I'll link to it in the description. Alright, let's just touch a little bit more on inverters. Do you really need one? Well, you can plug in devices from home, so you might. I purchased mine so that my wife could take a hairdryer to help her with the decision to go camping or not. It was a waste of money. Buy a portable shower and a toilet instead, and your partner will go with you every time. Comforts of home. However, if you feel you might need one, buy that one that will run an appliance you intend to use. For example, if I buy a 1000 watt inverter and I want to run a 1500 watt coffee machine, that isn't going to work. So I need to buy a 1500 watt or a 2000 watt inverter to run that coffee machine. Now, if your device uses a lot of power, start your engine and plug in your solar panel, or one or the other, or both, and then at least you're putting something back into the battery if it's discharging. You're not using a coffee machine for an hour, so you're only going to get 5 minutes worth of use, so that will be fine. Now, I've only ever used mine for charging electric chainsaw batteries, mobile phones and camera batteries. Never been used for a hairdryer, which is why I bought it. So there you go. If you do buy an inverter, there are two types. There's a modified and a pure sine wave. There are three main differences between the two, and that is cost, efficiency and interference. So let's look at cost. Modified sine wave inverters are far simpler. They're easier to make and have fewer components, therefore are much cheaper to buy than their pure sine wave counterparts. However, pure sine wave inverters are far more efficient. The interference side of things, so the pure sine wave inverter produces a cleaner output waveform which is very little harmonic vibration, whereas the modified version can cause interference. An example of this would be buzzing on a radio. If you're only running pumps or basic equipment, a modified sine wave inverter is fine. However, if you are running, or might in the future run, sensitive equipment like a laptop or something like that, get yourself a pure sine wave inverter. Oh, this is the part where we have a look around the car. Got my coffee. I'm down here at the lovely Cannons Creek, and there's a few people about, but I found a nice secluded area. So let's talk about auxiliary battery systems. So hiding down in there somewhere is the alternator. The alternator provides about 14.5 volts at 90 amps. That is enough to charge that battery over there and this battery over here from starting. These are the starter batteries. So power comes up from the alternator in the form of these black and red cables. I have an additional black cable on both sides going to the chassis of the car. That's just as an additional battery. I've renewed the cables. You can see the one over there is blue. That's the positive cable. On this side it's red. So from here, excuse the children, they're playing in the water. From here, this is a fused battery terminal. As you can see, it's got fuses in there. They've got little fuses for some things and the bigger fuse for the others. Just a precautionary fuse. Now, so power comes from the battery here into this fuse. So this fuse has a cover on it. I don't know if I can actually get the fuse cover off. There you go. That's the fuse in there. That fuse lives on the side of the car. Power comes out of that fuse, goes into my battery isolator switch. There. Comes out of the isolator switch, goes through the bulkhead down there. Now, the negative lead, which is connected to it, comes here, goes straight through the bulkhead where they join together. So that's that bit. They come in through the bulkhead in here and they run under the carpet, under this trim, along there. And as you can see, I've removed the rear seats to ignore the tripod. So it runs up here, comes out here, and there's the twin cable there. There's a few bits and pieces added to it, but ignore them. They're just the cables that run through to the front for the monitor, battery monitor, etc. So these two cables here are 6 gauge. And 6 gauge was recommended so you don't get too much voltage drop from the back to the front. However, the DC to DC charger will make up for any voltage drop, and it will store the voltage until it's got enough voltage for it to send through to the battery. Now, the 4 lights on the front of this DC to DC charger, that means it's a lithium battery. It's blue. Blue normally means lithium. This is the state of the battery. That means it's a good charge. I'm running a few things in the back here, so it's going to be used. but that will go green when it's fully charged. This is the solar input. Now I'll show you that. This is where I plug in the solar blanket here. It plugs into this Anderson socket here. That usually goes up on the roof, or there's enough cable to reach around to the bonnet, or out into the sun if I'm in the shade. And I can generally move my solar blanket around wherever I want. When there's an input from the solar blanket, this will light, and when the engine's running, this will light. This is a picture of an alternator. So power is going into this box. Now, as I said in the previous statements, this is a 50 amp DC to DC charger with MPPT solar. Okay, so it says it on the top there, look, 50 amp DC DC onboard battery charger with MPPT. So this is the Renogy all-in-one box. It does everything. Now if you go and purchase the ones that I listed in my previous video, you can get this Bluetooth monitor. This just connects into the system and plugs in at the side behind here, and that allows you to connect your mobile phone to the box and see what the output and input of battery charging is. Now in the front I have a LCD battery monitor, and that's what this shunt does here. This shunt is part of that, and as you can see, this shunt has replaced the earth bus bar that I was talking about. All the earth connections come to this one point here, so they're all connected together. You can see there's an earth going into here, there's an earth going around this way, this is coming in from the front battery, this is the earth for the battery, this is the earth for another earth from the battery, and they're all connected together. So one comes from the back of the battery up there, one comes from inside, it's connected to the poles inside. So this is the battery box. Now this is the oldie battery box, Adventureridge. Adventureridge is Oldie's camping brand, and that's an Adventureridge battery box. That was a third of the price of everybody else's battery boxes. Apart from Kings have their own battery box too. Now there's a gauge on the top there, you can't really see it in the sun, and there's a switch. The Achilles heel of this battery box is that switch there, because that switch gets turned off when you put a swag or a sleeping bag on that side, and that's not good. Anyway, regardless of the battery box let me just pop you on here a second and get some hands free. Regardless of the battery box you choose, presume you can see, you need to have a strap. I connected some anchor points on there, and I strapped this battery on. It won't move. That's just the lid moving. The bottom's quite secure. I put some rubber underneath just to give it something to bounce on. So when I talked about what you have connected in your car, this is the plug from the fridge freezer and the cable I shortened down and modified. This had an auxiliary plug on the end, and it plugged into one of the auxiliary sockets on the end there. Now the problem is that not all auxiliary sockets have the two indentations that hold that particular plug into that socket and stop it creeping out. So if I was to use one of these and it crept out, then the fridge would turn off and all the food would spoil, and if I'm on a trip, I might not even know that it had turned off. So I switched it for a Anderson plug. So I crimped a cable on the end, but then I had to put an inline fuse in, and it's the type with a light that illuminates if the fuse blows, and then I shortened it down, and that's just long enough for me to pull the fridge out on the slide and without stretching the cable. So that's all good. There are a couple of large connectors. Now I only need to actually use one, and I run the other connector from here. So this is what's called, let me just turn it around a little bit and lift you up. This is a 4-gauge cable, 4-gauge power, 4-gauge earth. Now they run to this inverter. This is a 2000 watt continuous 4000 watt surge pure sine wave inverter. It is the dodgy Chinese inverter that I'm not always 100% works. It does work. I'm not sure whether it's 2000 watt, you never know. Things behave a bit strangely sometimes, but anyway, it is what it is. I can plug any appliance with the sockets here. I can plug any appliance from home in there. It is under 2000 watts and it will run. Now this gets hot. There's a fan at the back. You have to keep the fan clear, and it will trip if it thinks there's too much power being drawn, or it can't cope with it. And there's a monitor for it here, although the battery's gone flat in it. So that's, and this make of this inverter is Renoster, and that happens to be Renogy, so you can see why I'm a bit concerned about its origin. Anyway, going back to the auxiliary battery charging. So when the power comes through from here, from the engine bay, and goes into here, and then comes out, it goes to this 70 amp trip switch. That's the same as putting in a fuse. That's there to protect the battery. If the terminals come off and short out, that will trip. Hopefully it will trip. And that's my protection in the back here. Also, this 4 gauge cable that goes to the inverter is covered on a 200 amp trip. The 200 amp trip being well over probably what I need, but I didn't want it tripping out just at the drop of a hat, so that's another sort of useful addition protection system. Now, one problem I have here is that the battery box lids never seem to fit that well. I don't know what it is, but anyway, so that's better. It's about on properly. So that's pretty much my battery system. This here is a Bluetooth module that allows my phone to connect. I'll show you that in a minute. And this is what's called a shunt. Now that took over from my bus bar, as I said, but it's also the shunt that goes to the battery monitor. So we'll take a look at that now. Okay, we're in the front of the vehicle now. First thing I'm going to show you is the Bluetooth module. So let's turn it on. There it is there. Let's see it. So it's called DC Home. It's a Renogy module that comes with the Renogy device. You get this free, and as you can see, it's bringing power in from the alternator to the battery, from that battery to the DC to DC charger, then to the auxiliary battery. Gives you voltages and what current you're drawing and what current you're providing, etc., etc. Now the reason I haven't started the engine is because I wanted to show you what I said about electrical devices turning off when you're starting your battery. This is because starting the battery is essential. So if you watch the radio, which is on, I've turned the volume down. I'll show you that it's actually on. So it's actually on. But watch this when I turn the ignition key. You see it goes off, comes back on again.
External power disconnected. Continuing on back.
So that's what happens when you start your car. All the electrical devices will turn off, and once your engine's running, then it'll turn back on again. Now, I did have a problem with this Oricom UHF radio. So if I turn it on, what would happen was I'd put it onto scan like this. Let's hope I don't pick anybody up because the volume's up high. So it would be on scan, and then I'd stop the engine, and then I'd think, oh, I'll get going again, and I'd switch it on again like that. And in the process of it being on, because it will work with the ignition on, and that pause where the battery went turned off would lock that up, and it would stop it from scanning. So I had to fit a timer, and you'll notice that if I do that again, it turns off, and the radio stays off even though this radio has come back on. That's come back on. This is still off. It's on a 10-second timer. Now once the engine's running again, this will turn back on, and that's alleviated the problem of the radio locking up and taking 2 minutes to reset itself and things like that. Okay, so the reason I've started the engine is I wanted to show you my battery monitor down here. I'll just turn the light on. You can turn the light off because obviously at night you don't want a big glowing red green thing sticking in your face. So this is the battery in the back, 100 ampere hour, it's a 100% charge, 13.5 volts. Now I've got things turned on in the back, and if I disconnect everything, turn it all off, that will go up to about 14.3, 14.4 volts. Then this is the amps that's been put in by the alternator. So I've got to be careful here. I'll just put it in neutral. I hope you can still see. You can see it increasing as I rev the engine. That's just because the alternator's speeding up and slowing down. I can't put this into up into park because you won't be able to see it. But now when you turn the engine off like so, what happens then is this tells you now the output that the battery's giving out. So it's only giving 0.1 of an amp out at 1 watt, and it'll last for 25 hours at that, even 43 hours. It's still sorting itself out. As you can see, the hours are going up. So it's now saying at 0.02 of an amp I'll be able to get 58 hours, well, almost 58 hours of charge from that battery. That's good, that's not bad. So we can leave that on for now. So there you go. I'll put the car back in park because it won't start otherwise. So you can see how it all works, how I've got it wired in. Where in some of the fuses I've the screw clamps down onto the actual loose cable. On the vast majority I've used metal crimps. I've got myself a crimping tool, it's in the back there, and I crimp on metal crimps so they're on properly. You can't rely on the little small crimp-on type plastic clips. You've got to use the proper metal ones with a proper crimping tool. Make sure you put a battery isolator in, because when I stuffed up my alternator, like I said at the start when I went through the muddy puddle, isolating the back of the car meant that I wasn't giving valuable battery power into the back of the car for no reason. There was no reason to be powering the fridge, there was no reason to be powering all the little lights and gubbins in the back. So I just isolated it, and it allowed me to get home. It was a bit of a struggle, battery anxiety, 2 batteries luckily, and we managed to get home. By the time we got from Licola back to Berwick, the headlights were like candles. It was night time, so I had to have the lights on. I didn't dare put the indicators on, I didn't dare touch the brakes because the brake lights take quite a lot of power. Just tried it. Luckily it was quiet, and we managed to time it well, and I took the back road home that has no lights on it, and you couldn't believe the relief we had when we drove up the drive and parked in front of the house. I tell you, I could not see the garage door parked a metre away with the lights. It was that dim. The batteries were completely dead, but it managed to get us home. We had no speedometer, that had stopped. We had well, it stopped and then it came back on and it went off again. We had no dashboard because the lights were all dimmed right down, we couldn't see it. Oh, it was, I mean, we had everything crossed just to get home, and we managed to get home. At one point we were going to send somebody out, and I was going to stay with the car and sleep with it, bring it back in the morning, jump start it and bring it back in the morning, and get my brother-in-law was going to come and get picked up and taken home. So you know, we were very lucky. So the key is always make sure that you put in a battery isolator in, because if I hadn't had that battery isolator, I don't reckon I would have got home. So Sorry, somebody on a wakeboard down there. So, any questions, put them in the comments. Please don't be abusive. If you see something I've done wrong, please just advise me and I'll try and correct it. I don't like to do things wrong, and I'm only a volunteer. I'm only doing this for the benefit of you people out there. I don't make any money out of this, so I don't need any abuse. So please don't put abusive comments. Please only put constructive comments too. You know, if you want to know something, that's fine. But if you think I've done something wrong, don't get abusive. It just doesn't. I just won't publish a comment, so it's not worth it. It's not a hot day, but it's warm. And I've still got the radio on. I'll turn that off. Please like and subscribe. If you feel like you want to support the channel, I have a Patreon account, and there's a link on a couple of the videos. I can link to it in this video. I'll also link to my video about getting ripped off with solar panels and what to look for, and I'll link to Renogy's DC to DC charger in the description below. I'm not affiliated with Renogy whatsoever. I don't have any problem with Red Arc if you want to go with Red Arc. I just find that their prices are just extremely high. Good old Australian, well, they say it's good old Australian equipment, but their solar blanket is made in China. So, you know, is it worth the $1,800 that you pay for it when you can buy a King's one for $100? Probably not. You know, we talk about solar panel controllers as well, but the King's one comes with its own controller, so that's worth having as well. Anyway, I'm rambling on now. I don't know what I'm talking about, so I hope to see you out there. Please like and subscribe. Join Patreon if you feel you want to, and thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.